is going to be a little bit of a deeper dive into examining, what are the mechanisms that the U.S. is using to fund Israel? What are the selectively enforced oversight mechanisms in the United States? How is the United States bypassing them? And then how might the International Court of Justice force U.S. compliance with U.S. oversight mechanisms? Okay, so how is the U.S. funding Israel? So there is, sorry, I'm just bouncing between screens here. So the U.S. typically funds Israel through a 10-year memorandum that actually pledges billions yearly. This is not legally binding. However, the U.S. Congress has always upheld it. Most of the funding goes through as foreign military financing. And so these are grants to purchase U.S. defense items and quote unquote services. Israel is allowed to use foreign military funding for something called offshore procurement. And so that actually refers to developing and purchasing weapons domestically. So it's basically funding for Israel to build up its own military and weapons manufacturing. Israel is allowed to use foreign military financing for direct commercial sales, purchasing directly from U.S. weapons manufacturers rather than through the usual government-to-government foreign military sales. There is limited oversight, accountability, and transparency, in particular with direct commercial sales. And also, just as a note, Israel, but not the U.S., then actually gets the interest from the foreign military funds. Okay, so what ignored oversight mechanisms are there? In February of 2023, so basically a year ago, Biden issued a conventional arms transfer policy. This was seen as strengthening standards. It prohibits transfer of U.S. weapons that are likely to be used against civilians. The oversight is supposed to come from the president, although Congress can also oversee. Because this can be revoked by a president in the future, there have been calls actually for the U.S. Congress to act to enshrine it into law. Let's see, there is also end-use monitoring. So end-use monitoring is supposed to track compliance with weapons transfer terms. It is, however, mostly focused on protecting U.S. technology rather than looking at civilian harm or international law. And then also in August of 2023, there was the Civilians Harm Incidents Response Guidance was issued. This is a framework to investigate civilian harm by partner governments using U.S. weapons. And there are supposed to be recommendations of investigations that can include cessation of U.S. weapons transfers. Oops, sorry, going to the next screen here. There is also, so this one you might be hearing a little bit more about, the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. That is a mouthful. The acronym is a little bit less of a mouthful, EWIPA. So the US signed this in November of 2022. However, it's not legally binding. By signing, the US is supposed to promote EWIPA and seek to get other states on board, although again, it's not legally binding. And also signing has not stopped the US from giving explosive weapons to Israel without condition. In January of last year, 2023, there was the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan, or CHAMRAP, as I'm probably butchering an acronym pronunciation of that. So Lloyd Austin released this in Lloyd Austin, which you may also recall is one of the defendants in the Center for Constitutional Rights lawsuit. He released this in January of 2023, so about a year ago. It indicates that the Department of Defense will change their approach to address civilian harm coming from the US and from partners of the US operations. Objective 9 of CHAMRAP discusses civilian harm in terms of security cooperation relationships. So this is something that should apply to Israel. And needless to say, the US is not showing commitment to CHAMRAP right now. So the Leahy Act, you may hear more about. Also, this is commonly referred to as just Leahy Act. The State Department and the Department of Defense actually both have Leahy laws. And so these are supposed to block supporting foreign militaries that grossly abuse human rights. The State Department is supposed to vet recipients, and a single incidence of violation is supposed to be sufficient to enact restrictions. Credible concern is supposed to be sufficient as well. And also, just as a heads up, it's linked in our session packet. You can actually see the submission website for human rights concerns for Leahy Act investigations, if you're curious. And I'm not aware of any calls to flood the website with submissions regarding Palestine at present. With the Leahy Act, there is a loophole if the State Department says they cannot identify end user military units when a transfer occurs. So this actually applies to most transfers to Israel. A recent law change and then a 2021 congressional mandate indicated that the State Department should be giving Israel a list of units, Israeli units, if any, that would be ineligible to receive US support. The Israel has actually never listed an Israeli military unit as off limits under the Leahy Act, though. And during wartime, the US requires that gross human rights violations also violate international humanitarian law in order to apply Leahy restrictions. The US is not evaluating Israeli compliance with international humanitarian law. At present, again, these are things that might change with pressure. And Biden's recent statement on Sunday does indicate that he is at least having to give more lip service to caring about Israeli aggression and the catastrophic loss of life in Gaza. So under the Leahy Act, the US has actually developed a unique review for complaints about Israel called the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum. It basically requires a higher standard for determining violations. So normally with the Leahy Act, there are a few different US units that can say, okay, this is something that we really need to take seriously and look at. But then when it comes to Israel, there actually has to be consensus among these different offices and different units. So that means that the bar is higher. Also, with the Israeli vetting forum, Israel is given 90 days to respond, and this has come under critique by people saying that this is actually excessive delay. And then another thing to point out, sorry, I know this is a lot, this is also linked as well. The US says Israel's military justice system is effective actually in the military aid agreement between the US and Israel. This military aid agreement with Israel and the US actually came out when the US was doing a number of military aid agreements with other nations However, the one with Israel is unique in that it says that Israel's military justice system is efficient. And this is significant because, it's basically the US is saying, oh, okay, we trust Israel's judgment we trust Israel to investigate itself, essentially. Okay, so another thing that you might be hearing a fair amount about is Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. So this bars supporting security, including counterterrorism efforts in countries that repeatedly violate human rights. So presumably, even though Israel is saying, that they're going after Hamas and this is all counterterrorism, Section 502 presumably would say, well, actually 502, still applies. You got to apply this. And so what this does is Congress has a process to require the State Department to do a human rights report on and restrict support to a country in question. If the State Department does not give a report within 30 days of the request, no support may be given to the country in question until the State Department gives its report. After a report is received, any Congress member can do a resolution to terminate or condition support to their country. So there was recently a resolution to request a report on Israel that Bernie Sanders raised, and it was tabled in the Senate on January 16th, 2024. So, Bernie Sanders was giving, at least lip service to caring about 502, and the Senate is basically said, no, we're not going to do this. Basically, we're going to ignore Section 502 when it comes to Israel. Okay, going on to the next slide. So you may also hear about ACA, the Arms Export Control Act, joint resolutions of disapproval, or just ACWA. The State Department must inform Congress of particular large weapon sales under this. Congress can block with a joint resolution if there are enough votes to overcome a presidential veto. So if Congress, unanimously was against arming Israel and could overcome a veto by Biden, then we might see ECWA being used as a mechanism of justice. However, we also have to note that Israel, along with NATO and certain other allies, get special treatment under ECWA. So what this means is that the amount of weapons sales that require congressional notification can actually be up to 100 million for Israel, which is high. And also, Congress only has 15 days to act on weapons sales to Israel. So that's shorter. Other countries, Congress has longer to respond. Okay, so then how is the US bypassing its oversight mechanisms? And, again, perhaps we should actually be referring to them as selective enforcement mechanisms. Okay, so I've kind of grouped these into broad categories. The conventional arms transfer policy and use monitoring, the civilian harm incidents response guidance, the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Sorry, that's a mouthful, I know. And the civilian harm mitigation and response action plan. All of these are actually really easy to selectively apply without internal repercussions. They don't really have mechanisms built into them to be enforced. With the Leahy Act, there are loopholes in the act, and the US is also quite deliberately choosing not to investigate. With Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, with this, what we see is that Congress is choosing not to act. Okay, let's see. With the Arms Export Control Act, or ECWA, Joint Resolutions of Disapproval. Um, so actually a mechanism that's being used to arm Israel is the War Reserves Stock Allies Israel. And this has actually been used since October 7th of last year. It has no waiting period and is not subject to ECWA blocking. Um, yeah, and the State Department has not publicly notified Congress of transfers to Israel since October 7th as well of 2023. And Biden has also used emergency authority in order to bypass the required 15 days congressional period, which is shorter than with other countries. But Biden has actually used that twice since October 7th. On October 9th, he used it to give 147.5 million to Israel. And then on December 29th, he used it to give 106 million to Israel. Okay, so how might the IJC force compliance? So I do want to emphasize this really is not a matter of the US not having laws that can be applied. This is a matter of the US using laws selectively without regard to human rights principles in order to advance what it has decided or its interest. Before December 2023, Democrats were saying that Biden had reversed harm Trump did to the esteem that, well, mostly European allies had for the US. And if that was true, Biden may have reversed those quote unquote gains with some and severely damaged the reputation of the US in really just a matter of months. Um, this is something that can put negative political pressure on Biden, though such pressure does have to continue when Biden finds alternative means to support Netanyahu's campaign of terror, um, such as cutting funding or the UN agency providing humanitarian relief to Gazans. Some other things to consider. Uh, the world stage right now is focused on US hypocrisy. Also, the US cannot hold on to its superpower monopoly indefinitely. While Biden appears to be stuck in a very 1950s view of how the US operates in the world, the prediction that the US is losing its superpower monopoly has actually been forecasted for some time now. There's a fair amount of literature on this, from various professionals and academics. And this isn't stuff that's not unknown to the US government. The US has actually been commissioning some of this forecasting and research. I believe actually one of the links is to a report that has been commissioned by the US on this topic, on forecasting the future and looking at geopolitics in that. So it's possible that people in the US government who are aware of this changing dynamic, might be able to try to encourage the US to rein in, and again, this is actually really out of self-interest. There could also be pressure from other countries as well. And this could take the form of shifting economic relationships and business away from the US. Public opinion could play a role. And so then also, possibly internal pressure within the US government in conjunction with these things all together collectively might be able to put some limits on US impunity. If the US bucks the International Court of Justice and international consensus, even though the International Court of Justice does not have an enforcement mechanism, the US may suffer irreparable damage to its image and negotiating powers. It is important to keep in mind that countries do have options besides the US for trade and large aid packages, and BRICS, which is mostly a global South alliance. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, could expand in power and scope if UN affiliated agencies are weakened by the US and allies when the US and Israel do not get what they want, or if they're deemed ineffective and or beholden to US interest. So, this could include if the ICJ doesn't rule favorably on South Africa's case ultimately. And, while the UN definitely seems like a very established organization, I will just point out that before the UN, there was the League of Nations, which actually no longer exist. So, these entities are subject to changing geopolitical dynamics. And, we could quite likely, I should say, quite possibly in the future, see BRICS become more of a dominant force. There's actually a number of other nations who, are joining BRICS as well. So it is growing in importance, and exactly what that trajectory looks like, we shall see. And just also note, it's important to note a rules-based international order only works if nations are invested in it and agree to play by its rules. As the US is losing its superpower monopoly, it might be able to be effectively argued to some US government officials that ultimately a rules-based international order really is in US interest. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. This information is available in the session packet. The slides are available as well in that packet.